Well, it's been over a month now and over 100 images shot on my very first Foveon sensor camera, and I have a lot of thoughts about it. So let's discuss that now. Welcome back to the Snappiness YouTube channel. I hope you're doing well wherever you are in this crazy world right now. On this channel, I like to shoot with older digital cameras like the Sigma SD14, which I picked up just about a month ago. I know a lot of you are eager to hear about how this camera performs and what it's like using it. I'm not ready to give a very full review of it yet, but I am ready to give some initial thoughts and at least give you an appetizer of what's to come. I'm going to divide this video into several different sections covering just about everything about this camera and everything I've touched so far using it. And yeah, there's some interesting stuff, so let's go ahead and just jump right into it. Let's start with using the Sigma SD14. What is it like using? Well, the grip and the feel of the camera is not unlike other DSLRs released in this era. This is a 2007 camera, so that's the same era as the Pentax K-1D, Canon 40D, Nikon D80, and other kind of prosumer, consumer DSLRs. And I've used all those DSLRs that I mentioned. For that 2006 to 2008 period is a time I'm particularly obsessed with. So even though this feels similar to those, it is the worst feeling out of all of them. It's just a little more blocky and plasticky than those DSLRs that are a little more rubberized and a little bit more ergonomic. And I don't think the SD14 is alone in this, unfortunately. I think the Sigma camera line, at least early on, kind of has these more plasticky builds. But you still got a little decent grip and it is rubberized a little bit, so not the worst thing in the world, I guess. Okay, so the feel of the camera is not the best. The controls are really quite weird. This has been, out of all the old digital cameras I've tried, the hardest to get used to. Let me just show you a few areas, some samplings of this camera and its controls and why it's a little weird. So first off, on the left-hand side, this is how you turn the camera on. And the only reason you know that is because it says off. So surely by changing it to a different mode, you'll turn it on. And that is the case. You turn it to single shot, multi-shot, timer, whatever, and that turns the camera on. That's a little weird, but you get used to that pretty quickly. The actual menu system, if you click into the menus, there is not a lot going on here. That is the case with a lot of older digital cameras before this period. By this point, though, digital cameras are seeing more and more things in the menu. So it's a little bit strange that Sigma doesn't have a lot going on here that you can change. And instead, to change a lot of the settings, you use the physical buttons and the dials in this really weird like dance. So here I will hold the function button and then turn the control dial next to the shutter button. And as I click through with the function button, it changes the setting. And as I twist the dial while holding down on the function button, it changes the setting. And this is everything from the metering mode to flash, remote control, the beeps the camera makes, just like a random assortment of options you can change. And this threw me off for a long time. I think I've finally gotten used to it, but it's a little bit weird. It just seems like some of that stuff could have just been in the menu, like to turn a remote on. Do you really need to cycle through a quick function menu? But it makes more sense for things like metering mode, so you can quickly switch through that. You also have this other menu which you might want to pay attention to. It says ISO and white balance, and here you can change the ISO and white balance. What's weird here is that you can't go up or down through it and cycle through it. If you pass the one you want, you just have to go all the way through and back to ISO 100, for instance, or with white balance, cycle all the way through and then go back to the one you wanted. So weird design choice there. That's just an example. Pretty much everything about how this camera's controls are laid out, it's a mix of foreign, just not how other cameras did it, and then I think even just poor execution. I just don't think it was designed that well. But that's just my opinion. What do I know? Next, I wanted to mention autofocus, and I think this is important because it threw me off for a while. My first several pictures with this camera were out of focus, but I didn't know that they were out of focus. I just thought the image quality wasn't very good. And I couldn't tell if it was shutter shake, if I was shaking the camera too much, or what was going on, until I really started inspecting the photos and realized they were just out of focus. So I went back out with the camera, and sure enough, I would autofocus, and then if I just switched to manual focus and touched it up just a little bit to get in focus all the way, the pictures were so much sharper, and that solved the problem. So it's disappointing that the autofocus seems unreliable on at least all the lenses I tested. It could have been the lenses, but I had a couple of Sigma lenses, and they all seem to have the same problem. And then beyond just being inaccurate, the autofocus is terribly slow. And this is coming from somebody who shoots a Pentax K-1 a lot, which is not a particularly fast focusing camera. I know cameras from this era are not fast focusing. This seems like the worst of the bunch. But that might not really be a big deal. This is a slower shooting type of camera anyway. So yeah, I don't know if that's going to upset anybody too much that's looking at this camera. And certainly for me, I think I'm just going to go to full manual focus on this camera from now on. Since I mentioned the lenses, let me go ahead and talk about that. When I bought this camera, it came with 5, 6, 7 lenses, I can't remember. I have sold all but one of them, and I was just not a fan with most of them. They're all early 2000s Sigma lenses, which Sigma does make some nice lenses, but none of them were really performing as well as I would like, even on this camera. The slightly smaller sensor and the lower megapixels, I was starting to see that the lenses weren't resolving very high. Or maybe they do well on other brands and it's the camera, but I don't think so. So right now I have one Sigma lens that I am using a little bit, and then my plan going forward is to get a M42 adapter. That's one of the few adapters you can get for this camera, and just use some of my excellent M42 glass on this camera, which is older than these Sigma lenses that I had. But I have some really excellent M42 glass, and I think it'll just outperform what I was getting. The other solution would be to buy newer Sigma glass, but I'm not quite ready to make the investment yet when I don't know how much I really like this camera. Okay, next up I want to talk about what you want to know about most, which is image quality and the photographs that I can get from this camera. So it's a mixed bag, like some of the other things you've noticed. I think most of it is just me getting used to the camera and how it handles situations, because it is wildly different than any other camera I've shot. For one, that whole thing with Foveons and don't overexpose the reds is absolutely true. You can blow out red highlights crazy fast and they are not recoverable at all. In fact, highlights in general are not very recoverable. In fact, dynamic range on this camera is not very high at all. So you really want to nail your exposure and then watch out for those reds. That's just the craziest thing, because with our natural eye, we've just not been trained as photographers to really think about that too much. But if you're shooting a scene that has highlights on red, so here's an example of my daughter. She was wearing this pink jacket and we were in the sunshine. And I'm able to expose for the rest of the picture, or so I thought, trying to expose the best I could. But when I take the picture, the highlights on the pink jacket are gone. They're totally lost and there's no recovering that. That's something just kind of to get used to on the camera. There are a couple other gotchas though. Like one other thing I noticed was that the auto white balance of the camera seems to get it wrong quite often. And at first I thought the camera was just producing really bad colors. But then I started looking at how it was white balancing, and I adjusted that slider in my editing software, and I realized that was it. It's just choosing the wrong white balance. It's just more indecisive than some of the other cameras I've used from this era. So I'll shoot a scene and then focus and recompose and do the same scene, and it chooses a totally different white balance. That happens on other cameras too. It just seems to happen on this camera a lot. And then when it does choose a white balance, it is seldom the right white balance. Once again, kind of like all this stuff, I'm not really totally throwing out photographer's error here, user error here. It might just be me having to learn a camera that works totally different than the other cameras I have. changing my metering modes, and maybe I don't use auto white balance. Maybe I jump in and select for it. So it could be me, but I just want to throw this out there for anybody else who's looking at this camera. This could be your experience. And then lastly on images, this is something to point out that's worth pointing out. Editing these Foveon files is a little bit tricky. Luckily for this camera, Lightroom does support the files. So that is what I finally ended up doing. I gave Sigma Photo Pro, which is Sigma's official software for these Foveon files, I gave it a good effort, but it is really slow. It's really buggy, and it was kind of difficult to use. It actually is fairly powerful. There's a lot of editing you can do in it. But when I found out Lightroom supported these files, I did a test. I imported one in Sigma Photo Pro and edited and exported it. And by edited, I mean I just kind of selected the default and then exported it. Then I did one in Sigma Photo Pro where I exported it as a TIFF and imported that TIFF into Lightroom. And then I did one where I just imported the X3F file directly into Lightroom, and I compared the differences. There is minor color differences with how Lightroom is kind of interpreting and setting the color defaults versus Sigma Photo Pro. But it was so minor, and I think it was just the white balance once again, just kind of correcting the white balance. Once I saw that, and I saw no other loss of detail or any crazy colors going on, I switched straight to Lightroom. I don't really want to use Sigma Photo Pro again. But I read somewhere on some of the later Sigma cameras, or maybe it's the earlier ones, Lightroom doesn't support the files, so definitely look into that if you're looking at one of these Sigma cameras, and just make sure the photo editing software you like to use lines up and works. Okay, this is a fun question that I've gotten a couple of times because I mentioned it. This camera has a removable hot mirror filter. I think all the interchangeable lens Sigma cameras do, and it's awesome. If you're going to have this huge mirror box anyway and go with the DSLR setup, I think DSLRs in the future, Pentax, should have removable hot mirror filters, because this allows you to shoot in infrared, in UV, full spectrum, whatever you're going after, really easily without a permanent conversion. I have not had a chance to properly use this in some like landscape infrared scenes, which is my favorite infrared work personally. The weather's just been not very good for that right now, and I'm still working on my lens situation with this camera. But I have done some test shots. I'll show that on the screen, just in full spectrum mode, and it's cool. I'm excited. So overall, what do I think after over a month of using this camera? I'm starting to think that this is a very specialty camera, which I know some of you are saying, yeah, duh. We always knew that Sigma's Foveon cameras were specialty cameras. But I don't think that really dawned on me. I just thought it was kind of going to be like another different type of CCD where you're going to get different colors and stuff. But it's really a whole system that just works differently. And shooting scenes is different. And I'm struggling to get used to that, though I've started to slow my pace down, double and triple check things before I take a photo, and kind of slow down through the editing process and really pay attention to the colors. And that's where I've gotten the best results. So with that said, then could I recommend this camera to very many people? I don't think so. It's an expensive camera, it's hard to get, and then on top of it, it's going to be really hard to get good results out of. Probably not everybody's cup of tea. I would just recommend a different DSLR. Thanks for watching. Go out there and shoot with whatever camera you have, and until next time, happy snapping.